My future mother-in-law stood in the palace gardens and told me I would destroy everything her son had worked for, that my presence at the royal wedding would be a humiliation neither the family nor the nation could survive. 3 weeks later, as the Archbishop of Canterbury read my full title before 2,000 guests and a global audience of 40 million, I watched her face transform from triumphant certainty to absolute devastation as she realized who I actually was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But that moment of revelation came only after months of careful silence, of enduring her calculated cruelty while protecting secrets that would reshape everything she thought she understood about power, lineage, and the future of the monarchy itself. 6 months before that garden confrontation, I woke each morning at 5:30 in my flat overlooking the Thames, preparing for the day ahead with the same methodical precision that had carried me through 12 years of diplomatic service. The kettle boiled while I reviewed briefing documents, my hands moving through the familiar ritual of preparing Earl Grey tea in the porcelain cup my grandmother had given me when I entered the Foreign Office. The routine grounded me during periods of transition, and the past 8 months with James had certainly qualified as transitional. James Fitzgerald entered my life at a charity reception for veterans, introduced by a mutual colleague, who thought we would appreciate each other's perspective on international development initiatives. He possessed the kind of easy confidence that came from genuine competence rather than inherited privilege, though I would later learn he had both in abundance. His work with sustainable agriculture projects in East Africa demonstrated a commitment to practical solutions rather than performative philanthropy. We discussed water management systems and microfinance structures while servers circulated with champagne, and by the end of the evening, he had asked for my contact information with the straightforward courtesy of someone accustomed to direct communication. Our relationship developed with the careful pacing of two professionals whose careers demanded discretion and whose schedules required advanced planning. James traveled frequently for his foundation work, and my position in the diplomatic corps meant extended assignments that took me to Brussels, Geneva, and occasionally more complicated postings where my language skills and regional expertise proved valuable. We communicated through video calls from different time zones, sharing observations about our respective projects while learning each other's rhythms and patterns. What I appreciated most about James was his genuine interest in my work, rather than polite questions designed to transition conversation back to his own concerns. He asked detailed questions about trade negotiations, listened carefully to my explanations of diplomatic protocol, and remembered the names of colleagues I mentioned in passing. His foundation operated in several countries where I had served earlier in my career, creating common ground that extended beyond romantic compatibility into shared professional understanding. James proposed 4 months into our relationship during a weekend in the Cotswolds, presenting a ring that had belonged to his grandmother with the explanation that family connection mattered more to him than ostentatious display. The sapphire surrounded by small diamonds caught the late afternoon light, as he explained his intentions with characteristic directness. He wanted partnership, not decoration. He valued my independence not despite my career but because of it. He hoped I would consider building something permanent with him, while maintaining the professional identity I had worked so hard to establish. I accepted because everything about our relationship had demonstrated mutual respect and genuine compatibility. We shared values around service, discretion, and the importance of work that extended beyond personal benefit. His proposal included explicit acknowledgement that my career trajectory would not be sacrificed to his schedule, that we would navigate competing demands through communication, rather than assumption about whose priorities took precedence. These conversations felt refreshingly adult compared to previous relationships that had foundered on unspoken expectations and unexamined assumptions about traditional roles. The engagement announcement appeared in the court circular 2 weeks later, a brief notice that James Fitzgerald had proposed to Miss Catherine Wells, and that a wedding would be arranged for the following spring. My colleagues at the Foreign Office offered congratulations with the careful neutrality that characterized diplomatic culture. My parents expressed delight that I had found someone who appreciated my qualities, rather than viewing my accomplishments as competition or threat. The response felt proportional and appropriate, exactly what one would expect for a competent professional entering a significant personal commitment. What I did not anticipate was the immediate summons to Ashford Manor, the Fitzgerald family estate in Hampshire, for the formal introduction to James's mother, Lady Victoria Fitzgerald. James had spoken of his mother with a mixture of affection and wariness, describing a woman who maintained exacting standards and definite opinions about proper conduct. His father had passed away 7 years earlier, leaving Lady Victoria as the primary authority on family matters and the keeper of traditions she considered essential to maintaining the Fitzgerald legacy. The manor itself projected the kind of understated grandeur that came from centuries of accumulated wealth rather than recent acquisition. The approach wound through carefully maintained grounds where ancient oaks framed views of rolling parkland. The house balanced architectural periods, incorporating Tudor foundations with Georgian additions and Victorian improvements, into a coherent whole that spoke of continuous habitation by people who possessed both resources and taste. Inside, family portraits lined the main corridor, generations of Fitzgeralds gazing down with expressions ranging from stern authority to bemused tolerance, documenting lineage back to the 16th century. Lady Victoria received us in the drawing room, positioned beside the fireplace in a chair that might as well have been a throne given the authority she projected from it. She was smaller than I expected, barely 5 feet tall, but her posture and bearing created an impression of substantial presence. Her silver hair was arranged with precision, her clothing expensive but deliberately understated in the manner of people who never needed to demonstrate wealth through obvious display. She extended her hand for a formal greeting rather than a warm embrace, her assessment of me beginning before James had completed the introductions. The tea service that followed represented a masterclass in polite interrogation. Lady Victoria asked questions with the precision of someone conducting research, inquiring about my family background, my education, my career progression, and my future intentions with a thoroughness that felt more like vetting than getting acquainted. Where had my parents attended university? What did my father do professionally? How did I envision balancing diplomatic assignments with family obligations? Did I understand the expectations that came with the Fitzgerald name? I answered honestly, explaining that my father taught history at a comprehensive school in Yorkshire, that my mother worked as a district nurse, that I had attended Oxford on scholarship, and that I intended to continue my career in foreign service because I found the work meaningful and important. My responses were met with expressions that conveyed polite attention layered over fundamental disapproval. Lady Victoria's questions became more pointed, establishing that my background did not include country estates, that my family connections would not open doors in certain circles, and that my professional ambitions might conflict with what she termed family responsibilities. James attempted several times to redirect the conversation, pointing out my accomplishments, my language capabilities, and the respect I had earned within diplomatic circles. His mother acknowledged these facts with the kind of dismissive courtesy that made clear she considered professional achievement a poor substitute for inherited position. She spoke at length about the Fitzgerald legacy, about maintaining standards, about the importance of understanding one's place within established hierarchies. The subtext was unmistakable even as the surface conversation remained superficially polite. The weekend visit extended to 3 days during which Lady Victoria demonstrated her vision of proper conduct through elaborate meals, formal dress requirements, and social events designed to showcase the Fitzgerald position within the local community. I met cousins, neighbors, and family friends who all seemed to share Lady Victoria's perspective on the natural order of things. Conversations revolved around people I did not know, events I had not attended, and reference points drawn from a world I had never inhabited. My attempts to contribute were met with polite redirection, as if my perspectives were charming but ultimately irrelevant to serious discussion. On our final evening at Ashford Manor, Lady Victoria requested a private conversation in her study. The room reflected her personality precisely, filled with dark wood furniture, leather-bound books arranged by topic, and family documents preserved in archival quality storage. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, positioning herself in the seat of authority while preparing to deliver what was clearly a prepared statement. She began by acknowledging that James had made his choice and that she would not openly oppose the engagement. However, she wanted me to understand certain realities that she felt James had perhaps not adequately explained. The Fitzgerald family maintained particular standards and expectations that extended beyond personal preference into matters of duty and legacy. James's position required a wife who understood the social obligations, the charitable commitments, and the public presence that came with the family name. She questioned whether my background had prepared me for these responsibilities, whether my career ambitions would allow me the flexibility to fulfill what she considered essential duties, and whether I truly comprehended what I was entering. Her concerns might have felt more legitimate if they had been delivered with genuine interest in my perspective, rather than predetermined conclusions. She did not ask about my capabilities or my willingness to adapt. Instead, she informed me of my deficiencies with the confidence of someone whose judgments were rarely questioned. My education, while adequate, lacked the social polish that came from certain schools. My professional focus, while admirable in its own way, suggested a temperament unsuited to the more subtle requirements of managing household affairs and social obligations. My family connections, while perfectly respectable for ordinary purposes, would not facilitate the kind of networking that benefited Fitzgerald interests. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I listened without interruption, recognizing that defending myself would be interpreted as defensiveness rather than legitimate response to unjust assessment. Lady Victoria concluded by expressing hope that I would seriously consider whether I was truly the right match for her son, whether my presence would ultimately serve his interests and the family legacy, or whether the kindest choice might be to step aside before everyone became too invested in an arrangement that might prove ultimately unsuitable. The drive back to London the following morning carried a weight that had not existed during the journey to Hampshire. James apologized repeatedly for his mother's conduct, explaining that she had always been protective of him, that she struggled with change, that she would eventually come to appreciate my qualities once she spent more time with me. His reassurances felt sincere but insufficient, addressing symptoms rather than the underlying condition. Lady Victoria had not been protecting her son from a genuine threat. She had been asserting control over a situation she felt was slipping beyond her authority. My work provided welcome distraction from family complications. The Foreign Office assigned me to a trade delegation traveling to Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, requiring 3 weeks of intensive preparation followed by 2 weeks of negotiations. The complexity of managing competing interests across multiple jurisdictions, while maintaining diplomatic relationships, demanded complete focus, leaving little mental space for processing the implications of Lady Victoria's assessment. During my time abroad, James sent daily messages updating me on wedding preparations that his mother had taken over with alarming efficiency. She had selected the venue, a historic church in Hampshire near Ashford Manor, without consulting my preferences about location. She had engaged a wedding planner who apparently understood exactly what kind of event was appropriate for the Fitzgerald family, which seemed to preclude discussing my vision for the celebration. She had begun drafting a guest list that included extensive family connections and social obligations, but allocated minimal space for my colleagues, friends, and family members. Each update arrived with James's apologetic tone, explaining that his mother was simply trying to help, that she had experience with these matters, that we could make adjustments if anything felt too far from what I wanted. But the pattern was clear. Lady Victoria was orchestrating an event that reflected Fitzgerald expectations, while systematically minimizing my participation in decisions that should have been jointly made. The wedding was becoming a performance of her vision, rather than a celebration of our partnership. I returned from Southeast Asia to find that invitations had been printed and mailed without my review. The design featured the Fitzgerald family crest prominently, with my name appearing in significantly smaller typeface as if I were an accessory to the main event rather than an equal participant. The guest list had been finalized with a ratio of approximately 4 Fitzgerald connections to every one person from my life. My parents had been allocated 15 invitations total for extended family and friends, while the Fitzgerald side exceeded 200 confirmed attendees. When I raised concerns with James, he admitted that his mother had moved forward more aggressively than he had intended, but suggested that fighting over details might not be worth the family conflict it would create. The wedding was 6 months away. Perhaps choosing our battles carefully made more sense than confronting every decision we disagreed with. His suggestion felt reasonable on the surface but represented a capitulation to his mother's control that I recognized as dangerous precedent. The engagement period that should have been filled with joyful planning instead became a series of skirmishes over territory Lady Victoria considered already claimed. She objected to my suggestion that we write our own vows, insisting that traditional Church of England ceremonies use standard liturgy for good reason. She dismissed my request to include readings from poets I admired, suggesting that established biblical passages were more appropriate for solemn occasions. She vetoed the quartet I had hoped would perform, explaining that she had already engaged musicians who understood the acoustics of the church and the expectations for such events. My mother, during a weekend visit to my London flat, observed the situation with the quiet concern of someone who recognized patterns she had seen before. She pointed out that marriages beginning with one party systematically overruled were establishing dynamics that would continue unless addressed early. She reminded me that I had built a successful career by refusing to accept others' limitations on my capabilities, and questioned whether I was applying the same principles to my personal life that had served me so well professionally. Her observations struck uncomfortably close to truths I had been avoiding. In my professional life, I documented concerns, escalated issues, and insisted on proper process when circumstances warranted. I did not accept being dismissed or having my expertise disregarded. Yet with Lady Victoria, I had been accommodating rather than assertive, telling myself that family harmony mattered more than winning individual arguments. My mother's gentle questioning forced me to examine whether I was being strategic or simply conflict avoidant in ways that would ultimately prove corrosive. The confrontation I had been postponing arrived 6 weeks before the wedding, when Lady Victoria summoned me to Ashford Manor for what she described as final wedding coordination. I arrived on a Saturday morning expecting discussion about seating arrangements or processional timing. Instead, I found Lady Victoria in the garden with her wedding planner, reviewing an entirely redesigned ceremony structure that bore almost no resemblance to what James and I had discussed. She had eliminated the reading I had specifically requested, replaced it with something from Corinthians that she deemed more appropriate. She had removed the unity candle ceremony that represented symbolic joining of our families, explaining that such American innovations had no place in proper English traditions. She had even altered the receiving line protocol to position herself more prominently than my parents, suggesting that as mother of the groom and lady of the manor, she should receive guests before my parents greeted them. Each change represented a deliberate diminishment of my role, a systematic assertion of Fitzgerald's supremacy over collaborative partnership. I stood in that garden, surrounded by 3 centuries of cultivated landscape that proclaimed the permanence of established order, and recognized that I faced a decision point that would define everything that followed. Lady Victoria concluded her presentation of the changes, then turned to me with an expression that mixed pity with determination. She had not asked for my input because she did not consider my preferences relevant to what was fundamentally a Fitzgerald family event. My role was to appear appropriately grateful for being welcomed into such an established family, to accept the wedding that had been planned on my behalf, and to recognize that my background simply had not prepared me to understand what truly mattered in these circumstances. Then she delivered the statement that crystallized everything I needed to understand about her perspective and her intentions. She informed me that several family members had expressed concerns about the appropriateness of the match, that maintaining the Fitzgerald reputation required careful consideration of public perception, and that she was increasingly convinced that my presence at the wedding would ultimately prove embarrassing to everyone involved. She suggested, with the kind of gentle cruelty that characterized her entire approach, that perhaps I should consider whether proceeding with the ceremony truly served anyone's interests. She was not requesting that I cancel the wedding. She was informing me that my participation represented a problem she wished I would solve by removing myself from the situation. The clarity was almost refreshing after months of veiled dismissals and polite diminishment. Lady Victoria had finally stated explicitly what her behavior had been communicating all along. I stood in the garden of Ashford Manor, 3 weeks away from what was supposed to be the celebration of my marriage, and recognized that I possessed information that would transform Lady Victoria's confident superiority into absolute mortification. Information I had been instructed to protect but which suddenly seemed far less important than the principle of allowing people to face consequences for their cruelty and their assumptions. What Lady Victoria did not know, what James did not know, what almost no one in the world knew, was that my career in diplomatic service represented only the most visible part of my professional identity. The position I actually held, the role I had been selected for 3 years earlier, and the reason my assignments took me to certain locations at specific times, remained classified at levels that prevented me from discussing them even with my future husband. I was not simply Miss Catherine Wells, career diplomat from Yorkshire. That identity was real but incomplete. The full truth, the title that would be read before the assembled guests and the global audience, represented something that would reshape Lady Victoria's entire understanding of power, privilege, and the hierarchy she had spent her lifetime defending. But that revelation would come later, at the moment of maximum impact, when her assumptions had fully crystallized into certainty. For now, I simply smiled at Lady Victoria in her garden, and told her I would give her concerns the consideration they deserved. The week following Lady Victoria's garden pronouncement, I returned to London with a clarity that felt almost liberating. Her suggestion that I remove myself from the wedding had finally stripped away the pretense of family harmony, revealing the fundamental power struggle that had been occurring beneath polite surfaces. I no longer needed to question whether her coldness represented adjustment difficulties or genuine hostility. She had answered that question definitively. James called that evening, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone attempting to manage a situation spiraling beyond his control. His mother had briefed him on our garden conversation, though her version apparently emphasized her concerns about wedding logistics rather than her explicit suggestion that my participation would prove embarrassing. He wanted to reassure me that everything would work out, that the stress of planning had made everyone more tense than necessary, that once the wedding concluded we could establish our own household rhythms independent of his mother's involvement. His reassurances contained an implicit request that I not escalate the conflict, that I accept his mother's behavior as unfortunate but ultimately temporary. The problem with this framework was its assumption that Lady Victoria's actions represented aberrant stress responses, rather than deliberate strategy. She was not lashing out due to wedding pressure. She was systematically establishing dominance while testing whether I would accept subordinate status as the price of admission to the Fitzgerald family. I told James the first needed time to think, which was true though not in the way he understood. The thinking I needed to do involved weighing obligations, assessing consequences, and determining whether the secrets I had been protecting served any purpose beyond enabling people to maintain comfortable illusions about realities they preferred not to examine. My position required discretion, but discretion served institutional interests rather than personal convenience. There were moments when silence became complicity, when protecting information actually protected injustice. The following morning brought an unexpected complication that would accelerate decisions I had been contemplating. My supervisor at the Foreign Office, Sir Michael Pearson, requested an immediate meeting at his private office rather than our usual departmental spaces. The location choice signaled that our discussion involved matters requiring additional security protocols and complete confidentiality. Sir Michael had mentored me since my early days in diplomatic service, recognizing capabilities that extended beyond conventional analysis into more specialized applications. He had been instrumental in my selection for the position I actually held, the role that remained classified even from most Foreign Office personnel. Our relationship balanced professional formality with genuine mutual respect, built over years of successful collaboration on sensitive matters. He greeted me with the careful courtesy that characterized all our interactions, offering tea before addressing the purpose of the meeting. His office reflected a career spanning 4 decades, filled with artifacts from postings around the world and photographs documenting relationships with leaders whose names appeared in history books. He had navigated Cold War tensions, post-colonial transitions, and the emergence of new global power structures with the kind of steady competence that never generated headlines but quietly shaped outcomes that affected millions. The matter he needed to discuss involved my upcoming wedding and the complications arising from Lady Victoria's increasingly public expressions of concern about the appropriateness of the match. Several individuals with connections to both the Foreign Office and the Fitzgerald family had conveyed to him that Lady Victoria was making inquiries about my background, my assignments, and the nature of my work. Her questions suggested she was attempting to discover information that might provide leverage or justify her opposition to the marriage. Sir Michael's concern was not that Lady Victoria would successfully access classified information through social connections. Security protocols prevented that possibility. His concern was that her inquiries were creating attention around my circumstances at a moment when maintaining my cover required that nothing about my situation generate curiosity or investigation. The wedding itself represented a calculated risk that had been carefully evaluated and approved. Lady Victoria's behavior was transforming an acceptable level of visibility into something more problematic. He asked directly whether I had disclosed any information about my actual role to James or to anyone in his family. I confirmed that I had maintained complete operational security, that James understood only what was documented in my official Foreign Office biography, that no one in the Fitzgerald family had access to information beyond what appeared in public records. Sir Michael nodded, unsurprised by my answer but needing to confirm what he already knew. The conversation then shifted to more delicate territory. He explained that circumstances had evolved in ways that created both challenges and opportunities regarding my situation. The role I had been fulfilling for the past 3 years was approaching a natural transition point. Certain operations had concluded successfully. Other initiatives required different capabilities than those I brought to the work. The department was considering whether my continued service in this particular capacity served institutional interests, or whether transitioning to a different position might prove mutually beneficial. The subtext was clear even as Sir Michael maintained careful diplomatic language. My wedding to James Fitzgerald, combined with Lady Victoria's increasingly visible opposition, and her efforts to investigate my background, had created complications that affected my operational effectiveness. A person whose circumstances generated curiosity could not function optimally in roles requiring complete anonymity. The Foreign Office was not terminating my service, but they were suggesting that perhaps the classified aspects of my work had reached their natural conclusion. Sir Michael continued, explaining that the transition being contemplated involved elevation, rather than demotion. My performance over the past 3 years had exceeded expectations. The successful resolution of several sensitive matters had generated recognition at the highest levels of government. There were positions available that would leverage my capabilities while acknowledging accomplishments that could not be publicly credited under current arrangements. These positions carried increased authority, expanded responsibilities, and formal recognition that current protocols prevented. One such position had become available quite recently due to the unexpected retirement of its previous occupant. The role involved coordination between diplomatic and intelligence services, required extensive international experience and demonstrated judgment in complex situations, and reported directly to the Foreign Secretary. It was the kind of appointment that typically went to individuals with 20 years of experience rather than 12, but circumstances had created an opening and my record had positioned me as a serious candidate. The appointment would require formal announcement and public acknowledgement of my selection. The position carried a courtesy title reflecting its significance within government hierarchy. While not hereditary nobility, the title conveyed authority and positioned its holder within formal protocol structures that governed official functions and state occasions. It was the kind of recognition that established credibility in rooms where informal authority mattered as much as formal rank. Sir Michael explained all of this with the careful precision of someone presenting information that required thoughtful consideration, rather than immediate response. He was offering me a significant professional advancement that would simultaneously resolve the operational complications created by my engagement to James Fitzgerald. The timing was not coincidental. The Foreign Office had been monitoring the situation, and had determined that managing my transition, now rather than waiting for it to become more problematic, served everyone's interests. The implications assembled themselves in my mind with the clarity of a completed puzzle. If I accepted this position, my title would be announced through official channels before the wedding. The announcement would include biographical information explaining my qualifications and career trajectory. Anyone who had been investigating my background or questioning my suitability for the Fitzgerald family would suddenly be confronted with evidence that their assumptions had been comprehensively wrong. I asked Sir Michael about the timeline for decision and announcement. He explained that the position needed to be filled within 6 weeks. If I accepted, the formal announcement would occur approximately 3 weeks before my wedding date, allowing time for the information to circulate through appropriate channels while providing me opportunity to brief James about aspects of my career I had not previously been authorized to discuss. The professional opportunity was genuine and significant regardless of its implications for my personal circumstances. This was not a manufactured solution to a family conflict. It was a legitimate advancement that recognized accomplishments and opened pathways to increased influence within structures that shaped international relations. The fact that accepting it would also comprehensively demolish Lady Victoria's narrative about my inadequacy was simply an additional benefit rather than the primary motivation. I told Sir Michael I needed to discuss the matter with James before making final decisions. He agreed this was appropriate, though he noted that certain aspects of the position would remain classified even from my husband until formal announcement occurred. I could explain that I had been offered a significant promotion requiring expanded responsibilities. I could not yet detail the specific nature of those responsibilities or the title that came with them. That information would be revealed through official channels in coordination with government communications protocols. The meeting concluded with Sir Michael's characteristic courtesy, his handshake conveying confidence in my judgment regardless of which path I chose. As I left his office and emerged into the corridor where other Foreign Office personnel moved through their daily routines, I recognized that I stood at an inflection point where personal and professional considerations intersected in ways that would determine trajectories for years to come. That evening, I met James at a restaurant near his office in the city. He arrived carrying the distraction of a difficult day managing foundation logistics, some complication involving funding commitments and donor expectations that had consumed his afternoon. We ordered wine and reviewed menus while he processed the residual frustration of bureaucratic obstacles to practical goals. His work genuinely mattered to him, and I appreciated this quality even as I prepared to introduce complications that would shift his attention from foundation concerns to more immediate personal matters. I waited until after our food arrived to explain that I had received a significant professional opportunity, requiring his input before I could accept or decline. James set down his fork, giving me his full attention with the immediate focus he brought to important conversations. I described the position in terms I was authorized to discuss, explaining increased responsibilities, expanded authority, and recognition of work I had been doing that he knew existed, but did not fully understand due to classification restrictions. James responded with immediate enthusiasm, congratulating me on the recognition and asking why I would consider declining such an obvious advancement. His support felt genuine and unqualified, reflecting the partnership values he had expressed when proposing. He had never viewed my career as competing with our relationship, but rather as essential to my identity, and therefore important to preserve and nurture. I explained the complication that made the decision more complex than simple career evaluation. The position carried a formal title that would be announced publicly. The announcement would occur approximately 3 weeks before our wedding. The information would likely generate attention and would certainly reach his mother, who would need to reconcile her assessment of my inadequacy with evidence that I held positions and recognition she had not anticipated. James processed this information with visible confusion, trying to understand why public acknowledgement of my professional accomplishments would create complications rather than simply correcting his mother's misperceptions. I explained as carefully as security restrictions allowed that the announcement would reveal aspects of my career that had not been publicly documented, that my work had involved responsibilities beyond what appeared in conventional diplomatic biographies, and that the title being offered reflected recognition at levels that would surprise people who understood only my visible career trajectory. His confusion shifted to something approaching realization, the recognition that I had been maintaining operational security even within our relationship, that there were aspects of my professional life I had not been authorized to discuss, that the woman he was marrying possessed capabilities and accomplishments he had not fully understood. He asked directly whether I had been lying to him about my work. I explained that I had never lied but had been operating under classification restrictions that prevented complete disclosure, even to intimate partners. The distinction between lying and maintaining classified information felt important to establish. I had told him everything I was authorized to share. I had never fabricated cover stories or created false narratives about my activities. I had simply not been permitted to discuss the full scope of responsibilities I carried, or the nature of certain assignments that took me to specific locations for purposes that were not captured in official diplomatic schedules. James sat quietly for several moments, processing information that required adjusting his understanding of our relationship and my identity. When he finally spoke, his question surprised me with its directness. He asked whether accepting this position and revealing my actual professional standing would please me specifically because it would prove his mother wrong about my suitability for the family. He wanted to know whether I was making career decisions based on strategic considerations in our family conflict rather than genuine professional evaluation. His question deserved honest response. I told him that the professional opportunity was legitimate and significant regardless of its implications for family dynamics. I would be genuinely honored to hold this position and believed I could contribute meaningfully to work that mattered. However, I could not pretend that the timing and the impact on his mother's perceptions were irrelevant to my considerations. She had spent months systematically diminishing me, based on assumptions about my background and capabilities. The announcement would reveal those assumptions to be comprehensively wrong, and I would not apologize for finding satisfaction in that prospect. James asked what the title actually was, what position could carry sufficient authority to transform his mother's understanding so dramatically. I explained that I could not disclose specific details until the formal announcement occurred, but that the position was senior enough to include protocol considerations that would affect how I was addressed at official functions and where I was positioned during state occasions. The title reflected governmental authority rather than inherited nobility, but carried equivalent weight in contexts where formal hierarchy mattered. The remainder of our dinner carried a tension that had not existed at the beginning of the evening. James was processing the recognition that I had maintained significant secrets throughout our relationship, that his understanding of my identity had been incomplete, and that the woman he planned to marry possessed dimensions he had not fully appreciated. His support for my career remained genuine, but he was grappling with the realization that support based on incomplete information differed from support rooted in comprehensive understanding. We parted that evening with less certainty than we had carried into the conversation. James needed time to process the new information and its implications. I needed to determine whether his processing would lead to continued partnership or to recognition that perhaps his mother's concerns about our compatibility had some merit, even if her reasoning had been entirely wrong. The following week brought daily conversations as James worked through his feelings about the classified aspects of my career and the implications of my accepting the promoted position. He spoke with colleagues who had experience in government service, trying to understand what classification protocols meant and whether maintaining secrets from intimate partners represented normal professional boundaries or concerning relationship dynamics. His inquiries were thoughtful rather than accusatory, reflecting genuine attempt to understand rather than immediate judgment. Lady Victoria apparently noticed the change in her son's demeanor during this period. She called me directly, something she had never done previously, to suggest that perhaps the wedding stress was affecting James more than anyone had anticipated. She wondered whether postponing the ceremony might give everyone time to approach the situation with clearer perspective and calmer emotions. Her suggestion was delivered with concern that might have seemed genuine if I had not recognized it as another attempt to create exit pathways for me to remove myself from circumstances she still believed she controlled. I told Lady Victoria that James and I were managing our relationship appropriately, and that any decisions about timing would be made jointly rather than in response to external pressure. She responded with thinly veiled warnings about the consequences of forcing unsuitable arrangements, about how marriage required more than romantic attachment, about the importance of knowing when to acknowledge that circumstances were not aligning as hoped. Each statement reinforced her certainty that I represented a problem requiring solution, rather than a partner deserving respect. What Lady Victoria could not have known during that phone conversation was that I had made my decision. I had accepted Sir Michael's offer. The formal announcement would occur in exactly 16 days. And at that moment, every assumption she had made about my inadequacy, every calculation about my suitability, every confident assertion about maintaining family standards would be revealed as based on comprehensive misunderstanding of who I actually was and what I had accomplished. The only question remaining was whether James would ultimately stand beside me when that revelation occurred, or whether his mother's months of subtle pressure combined with his discomfort about classified aspects of my career would prove sufficient to fracture our partnership before it was formalized. The days following my conversation with Sir Michael carried a peculiar duality. On the surface, I continued managing wedding preparations, attending fittings for a dress that Lady Victoria had selected with minimal input from me, and reviewing seating charts that systematically marginalized my family and friends in favor of Fitzgerald connections. Beneath these conventional activities, I was making decisions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of everything that was unfolding. I accepted the position Sir Michael had offered. The formal paperwork was completed through secure channels, my signature authorizing the Foreign Office to proceed with appointment protocols and public announcement procedures. The timeline was established with bureaucratic precision. The official statement would be released through government communications offices exactly 18 days before my scheduled wedding date. The announcement would include biographical information, career highlights, and the formal title that came with the appointment. What made those 18 days particularly notable was watching people operate within frameworks of understanding that I knew would soon be obsolete. Lady Victoria continued her campaign of subtle diminishment, each interaction reinforcing her narrative that I represented an unfortunate choice her son would eventually recognize as a mistake. She had moved beyond questioning my suitability to simply asserting it as established fact, her confidence apparently bolstered by what she interpreted as my passive acceptance of her control over wedding arrangements. During a meeting with the wedding planner at Ashford Manor, Lady Victoria presented revised ceremony protocols that positioned me even further into the background of what was ostensibly my own wedding. The processional order had been restructured to emphasize Fitzgerald family precedents. The receiving line had been reorganized to ensure that she would greet the most important guests before they reached me. Even the photographic shot list had been adjusted to prioritize family groupings that featured James surrounded by Fitzgerald relatives, with separate and clearly secondary images that would include me and my parents. The wedding planner, a woman named Philippa who had apparently coordinated events for the Fitzgerald family for 2 decades, presented these changes with the careful deference of someone who understood exactly where authority resided. She did not ask for my approval but rather informed me of decisions that had been finalized. When I attempted to raise concerns about the receiving line protocol, Philippa explained that Lady Victoria had very specific requirements based on family tradition and social expectations that really could not be modified without causing considerable confusion. I sat in that meeting room at Ashford Manor, surrounded by fabric samples and floral arrangements and carefully rendered diagrams of ceremony staging, and recognized that I was being systematically erased from my own wedding. The event being planned was not a celebration of partnership between equals, but rather a performance demonstrating Fitzgerald's supremacy and my acceptance of subordinate status. Every detail had been calibrated to establish hierarchy and reinforce the natural order that Lady Victoria believed governed proper society. What Lady Victoria could not have known as she reviewed seating arrangements and approved floral designs was that I was mentally counting down days until information was released that would require her to fundamentally reassess every assumption driving her behavior. 18 days until the announcement. 18 days of watching her operate with absolute confidence in narratives that were about to be comprehensively disrupted. James during this period exhibited signs of internal conflict that he attempted to manage through increased focus on his foundation work. He traveled to Kenya for a week to review agricultural projects, then immediately departed for a conference in Geneva about sustainable development financing. His physical absence from wedding preparations that his mother was controlling might have felt like abandonment if I had not recognized it as his strategy for avoiding confrontation he did not know how to navigate. We spoke via video calls during his travels, conversations that circled around the central tension without directly addressing it. James would ask about wedding planning, and I would provide updates that made clear his mother had assumed complete control. He would express concern and promise to intervene, but his interventions never materialized into actual changes to what Lady Victoria had implemented. The pattern revealed what I had begun to suspect. James wanted harmony more than he wanted justice. He hoped that accommodating his mother's demands in the short term would lead to improved family dynamics in the long term. A calculation that struck me as fundamentally flawed, but which he seemed committed to maintaining. During one particular video call, James attempted to address the underlying tension by suggesting that perhaps I was being overly sensitive about his mother's behavior. He acknowledged that she could be difficult and controlling, but argued that her intentions were ultimately positive, even if her execution was problematic. She wanted the wedding to be perfect. She wanted to ensure that everything reflected well on the family. Her methods might be overbearing, but her motivations came from caring about the outcome rather than from genuine hostility toward me. This reframing of Lady Victoria's systematic diminishment, as misguided caring rather than deliberate cruelty, represented exactly the kind of rationalization that enabled problematic behavior to continue unchallenged. I asked James directly whether he truly believed his mother's behavior reflected concern for my well-being, or whether he was simply more comfortable interpreting it that way because acknowledging her hostility would require him to take actions he preferred to avoid. The question created a silence that extended longer than video call delays could explain. When James finally responded, his answer revealed more through what it avoided than what it addressed. He suggested that perhaps we were both under significant stress, that wedding planning created tensions that would resolve once the ceremony concluded, that maybe we should focus on the future we were building together rather than on family dynamics that would matter less once we established our own household routines. His response confirmed what I had increasingly suspected. James loved me and wanted our marriage to succeed, but he was not prepared to establish boundaries with his mother that would create sustained conflict or require him to choose between us when she forced such choices. He was hoping that time and distance would solve problems that actually required direct confrontation and clear establishment of priorities. His approach was not malicious, but it was inadequate to the situation we actually faced. My parents visited London during this period, ostensibly to finalize their travel arrangements but actually to assess whether I was truly committed to proceeding with a wedding that seemed designed to minimize my participation in my own ceremony. My mother had developed the particular radar that comes from decades of nursing, the ability to detect distress that people were attempting to conceal. She observed the wedding planning materials spread across my dining table and asked direct questions about who had made which decisions. I explained the situation with the careful factual presentation I used in professional briefings. Lady Victoria had assumed control of virtually all wedding decisions. James was aware of this dynamic but had not intervened effectively. I had been systematically excluded from choices about ceremony structure, reception protocol, and even basic elements like which readings would be included. My mother listened without interruption, her expression shifting from concern to something approaching anger as the full scope of what was occurring became clear. My father, whose career teaching history had given him extensive experience with institutional power dynamics, asked whether I had considered that the wedding might be revealing truths about my relationship with James that would prove more problematic than whatever complications would arise from canceling the ceremony. He pointed out that marriages function through thousands of small decisions over decades, and that patterns established during wedding planning often predicted how future decisions would be navigated. If James could not or would not establish appropriate boundaries with his mother during an event that was ostensibly about our partnership, what would change once we were married and her sense of entitlement to involvement would only increase? His question struck at the core concern I had been avoiding examining too directly. I had been so focused on managing Lady Victoria's behavior and documenting the evidence of her systematic diminishment that I had not adequately considered whether James's response to the situation revealed fundamental incompatibilities that would persist regardless of how the current crisis resolved. My father was suggesting that perhaps the real problem was not Lady Victoria's cruelty, but rather James's unwillingness to effectively counter it. I found myself defending James even as I recognized the weakness of my defense. I explained that he was conflict avoidant by nature, that his father's death had left his mother as the primary family authority, and he had developed patterns of accommodation that were difficult to break, that he genuinely believed time would improve dynamics that I saw as requiring immediate intervention. My parents listened to these explanations with the careful courtesy of people who were allowing me to reach my own conclusions rather than imposing theirs. Before they returned to Yorkshire, my mother took my hands and said something that would echo through the coming weeks. She told me that I had built a career by refusing to accept other people's limitations on my capabilities, by insisting on recognition and respect, even when systems were designed to deny both. She asked why I was not applying the same standards to my personal life that had served me so effectively professionally. She reminded me that accepting disrespect as the price of maintaining relationships taught people that disrespect carried no consequences, which only encouraged more of the same behavior. After my parents departed, I sat alone in my flat and confronted the question I had been avoiding. Was I proceeding with this wedding because I genuinely believed my partnership with James would thrive despite his mother's hostility and his inadequate response to it? Or was I proceeding because canceling felt like admitting defeat, like allowing Lady Victoria to win whatever contest she believed we were engaged in? The honest answer was uncomfortable. I wanted to marry James because I loved him and believed we were genuinely compatible in many important ways. But I was also determined not to give Lady Victoria the satisfaction of driving me away from a relationship I had chosen. My motivations were mixed, combining authentic affection with stubborn refusal to be controlled by someone whose judgment I did not respect. The question was whether mixed motivations were sufficient foundation for a permanent commitment that would involve navigating James's family dynamics for decades. The announcement date was now 12 days away. I had not told James the specific timeline, only that the formal statement would occur in the weeks before the wedding. He had not pressed for details, perhaps recognizing that some information would be revealed according to official protocols rather than personal preference. I suspected he was relieved not to know exactly when the announcement would happen, as not knowing allowed him to avoid preparing his mother or himself for the disruption that was approaching. During this period, I received an unexpected call from Harrison Burke, the family attorney who had handled various Fitzgerald legal matters for years, and who had been peripherally involved in drafting the prenuptial agreement that Lady Victoria had insisted upon. Harrison asked whether I might be available for a brief conversation about some questions that had arisen regarding the wedding planning and certain contractual matters that required clarification. We met at his office in Westminster, a space that projected exactly the kind of understated authority that characterized established legal practice. Harrison was perhaps 60, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone whose client list included multiple titled families and whose discretion was legendary. He offered tea and engaged in preliminary pleasantries before addressing the actual purpose of the meeting. Lady Victoria had apparently asked him to review the prenuptial agreement in light of what she characterized as new information about my circumstances and background. She had expressed concerns that the agreement might not adequately protect Fitzgerald family interests, given certain ambiguities in my professional documentation. Harrison had reviewed the relevant materials and found nothing requiring modification, but Lady Victoria had been persistent about her concerns, suggesting that perhaps there were aspects of my career or background that had not been fully disclosed during the initial agreement negotiations. Harrison's careful phrasing made clear that he was not accusing me of deception but rather exploring whether Lady Victoria's concerns had any legitimate foundation. I asked him directly what specifically Lady Victoria claimed to have discovered that would require revisiting agreements that both parties had already signed. He admitted that her concerns were vague, more expressions of general unease than specific allegations, but that her persistence had been sufficient to warrant at least a conversation to ensure that everyone was operating with complete information. I recognized what was occurring. Lady Victoria was conducting research, attempting to discover information that might provide justification for her opposition to the marriage or leverage that could be used to encourage me to withdraw. Her inquiries to the family attorney represented one avenue of investigation. I wondered what other channels she was pursuing simultaneously, what other trusted connections she was activating in an effort to uncover whatever she suspected I might be concealing. I told Harrison with complete honesty that everything I had disclosed during prenuptial negotiations was accurate. My financial information had been provided in full. My career documentation reflected my actual employment. There was nothing in my background that constituted misrepresentation or concealment of material facts. What I did not say was that there were aspects of my professional role that were classified and therefore could not be disclosed even in legal proceedings unless specifically authorized by government protocols. Harrison seemed satisfied with this response, though he noted carefully that if any new information emerged that might affect the agreements, I would be obligated to disclose it promptly. I assured him that I understood my obligations and would fulfill them appropriately. The meeting concluded with his expression of hope that the wedding would proceed smoothly, and that family dynamics would settle into more comfortable patterns once the stress of planning was resolved. As I left Harrison's office and walked along the Thames back toward Whitehall, I reflected on how Lady Victoria's investigation was intensifying precisely as the information she sought was approaching public release. In 9 days, the official announcement would answer all her questions about my professional standing. In 9 days, her careful inquiries to family attorneys and social connections would be revealed as inadequate research preceding a conclusion she had reached prematurely. The irony was that Lady Victoria was correct that there were aspects of my background and career that had not been fully disclosed. She was simply wrong about what those aspects revealed. She suspected I was concealing deficiencies that would justify her assessment of my inadequacy. She would discover instead that I had been maintaining security protocols around accomplishments and authority that transformed her entire framework of understanding. That evening, I attended a farewell reception for a colleague, leaving the Foreign Office for an ambassadorial posting. The event brought together diplomats, intelligence officials, and policy advisors whose careers operated in spaces that rarely intersected with public attention. Several people congratulated me on the upcoming announcement, having been briefed through secure channels about my appointment. Their acknowledgement felt validating after weeks of Lady Victoria's systematic diminishment. One senior official, someone whose career had included postings in genuinely dangerous locations, and whose judgment I deeply respected, took me aside during the reception to offer perspective that he thought I might find valuable. He explained that he had known 3 people who had held the position I was about to assume, and that all of them had found the transition from operational work to coordinating oversight more difficult than anticipated. The role required different capabilities, less about personal analysis and more about managing competing institutional priorities and navigating complex bureaucratic dynamics. His advice was to remember that authority came not from title but from earned respect and demonstrated competence. The position I was assuming carried significant formal recognition, but that recognition would mean nothing if I did not continue proving myself through performance rather than resting on credentials. He cautioned against allowing the title to become more important than the work, against using formal authority as substitute for substantive contribution. His words were kind but pointed, offering the kind of mentorship that combined congratulation with challenge. He was reminding me that while the upcoming announcement would provide satisfaction regarding Lady Victoria's misconceptions, the real measure of my success would be whether I used the opportunity effectively to contribute meaningfully to work that mattered. The personal validation was legitimate but secondary to professional responsibility. I thanked him for the perspective and assured him that I understood the difference between recognition and accomplishment. The conversation reminded me that whatever satisfaction I derived from correcting Lady Victoria's assumptions, my primary obligation was to justify the Foreign Office's confidence in my capabilities by performing effectively in a role that carried genuine responsibility for outcomes that affected national interests. The final week before the announcement passed with dreamlike quality, each day feeling simultaneously endless and accelerated. Lady Victoria called twice to discuss final wedding details, her tone carrying an edge of triumphant certainty that suggested she believed she had successfully established complete control over the event and my role within it. James returned from Geneva and attempted to reconnect after his extended travels, but the distance between us felt wider than could be explained by physical separation alone. 3 days before the announcement, I finally told James the specific timeline. The official statement would be released in 72 hours. At that point, aspects of my career that had remained classified would become public information. The title I would hold would be formally announced through government channels. Everyone, including his mother, would need to adjust their understanding of who I was and what I had accomplished. James asked how he should prepare his mother for this information. I told him that no preparation was necessary or even possible. The announcement would speak for itself. Lady Victoria had spent months making assumptions about my inadequacy. Those assumptions were about to be definitively corrected through official channels that could not be disputed or dismissed. The collision between her confident certainty and documented reality would occur regardless of any preliminary warnings that might soften the impact. In the final hours before the announcement, I experienced something approaching calm acceptance. The performance was nearly complete. The evidence had accumulated. The revelation was approaching with governmental precision. And whatever happened next would at least unfold on a foundation of established truth, rather than comfortable illusions that served only those who benefited from others' ignorance. The announcement was scheduled for release at precisely 9 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, time to coincide with the morning briefing cycle when government communications received maximum attention from media outlets and professional networks. I woke at my usual hour, prepared my tea with the same methodical attention I brought to every morning routine, and reviewed the final draft of the official statement that Sir Michael had forwarded for my information the previous evening. The language was characteristically formal, employing the careful phrasing that marked all governmental announcements of senior appointments. The Foreign Secretary was pleased to announce the appointment of Miss Catherine Wells to the position of Deputy Coordinator for Intelligence and Security Cooperation, a role that would require her to liaise between diplomatic and intelligence services, while managing sensitive initiatives that cross traditional departmental boundaries. The statement included biographical information documenting my education, my years of service in various diplomatic postings, and specific accomplishments that could be publicly acknowledged despite their sensitive nature. The title that accompanied the position was listed with appropriate formality. Miss Catherine Wells would henceforth be styled as the Honorable Catherine Wells in recognition of her service and the authority vested in her new role. While not hereditary nobility, the courtesy title positioned me within official precedent structures that govern state functions, diplomatic receptions, and formal occasions where protocol determined seating, speaking order, and social hierarchy. I understood the implications with professional clarity. Lady Victoria had spent months dismissing me as inadequately prepared for the Fitzgerald family's social position. The announcement would reveal that I held governmental authority and formal recognition that exceeded anything the Fitzgerald family had achieved through inherited wealth and social connections maintained across generations. The collision between her confident assumptions and documented reality would occur within hours of the statement's release. The morning passed with surreal normalcy. I attended a routine meeting at the Foreign Office reviewing ongoing initiatives in Southeast Asian diplomatic relations. My colleagues who were aware of the pending announcement treated me no differently than they had the previous week, maintaining the professional courtesy that characterized our interactions regardless of shifting titles or responsibilities. The work continued because the work always continued, indifferent to individual circumstances or personal dramas playing out against institutional backdrops. At 9 o'clock precisely, the official statement was released through government communications channels. Within minutes, the announcement appeared on the Foreign Office website, was distributed through official media contacts, and began circulating through the professional networks that monitored such appointments. My phone remained silent initially, but I knew the information was propagating through systems that would eventually carry it to everyone who needed or wanted to know about senior governmental appointments. The first response came from my parents. My mother called at 9:15. Her voice carrying a mixture of pride and concern that I had grown accustomed to over the years. She congratulated me on the recognition while immediately asking whether I was prepared for the attention that would accompany such a public appointment so close to my wedding date. I assured her that I understood the implications and had made the decision with full awareness of what would follow. My father took the phone to express his own congratulations, characteristically focusing on the substantive responsibilities rather than the formal recognition. He wanted to know what the position would actually require, how it would change my daily work, whether I felt prepared for the expanded scope of authority. His questions reflected genuine interest in my professional development, rather than concern about social implications or family dynamics that would be affected by the announcement. By 10 o'clock, the information had reached the broader networks that connected governmental, diplomatic, and social circles where such appointments generated interest. My phone began receiving messages from colleagues, former classmates, and professional contacts offering congratulations and expressing surprise at my elevation to such a senior position at my age and experience level. The messages carried varying degrees of genuine pleasure mixed with curiosity about how I had achieved recognition that typically required additional years of service. James called at 10:30. His voice strained in ways that suggested he had been processing the announcement and its implications for the past 90 minutes. He began with congratulations that sounded sincere despite the tension I could hear beneath his words. He was proud of my accomplishment and impressed by the recognition I had earned. However, he needed to discuss how we would manage the situation with his mother, who had apparently already learned about the announcement through her own networks and was responding with considerable distress. I asked what specifically was causing Lady Victoria distress beyond the general fact that her assumptions about my inadequacy had been comprehensively disproven. James explained with obvious discomfort that his mother had spent months telling various family members and social connections that I was an unsuitable match whose presence at the wedding would reflect poorly on the Fitzgerald name. She had apparently been quite explicit in her assessments, describing me as a mid-level civil servant with limited prospects whose background and capabilities did not meet appropriate standards for the family. The announcement had revealed these assessments to be not merely unkind but factually wrong in ways that now reflected poorly on Lady Victoria's judgment rather than on my suitability. People she had spoken to were responding with confusion about why she had so thoroughly mischaracterized my professional standing. Some were apparently questioning whether her opposition to the marriage had been based on genuine concerns or simply on class prejudices that the announcement had exposed as baseless. James asked whether I could possibly call his mother to discuss the situation, perhaps to explain aspects of my career that she had not understood, maybe to help her navigate the social complications that were arising from the disconnect between what she had said about me and what had now been publicly documented about my actual accomplishments and standing. His request revealed the fundamental pattern that had characterized our relationship from the beginning. When conflict arose between his mother's behavior and appropriate boundaries, James sought to manage the situation through my accommodation rather than through establishing clear expectations for her conduct. I told James with careful clarity that I would not be calling his mother to help her manage consequences that flowed directly from her own choices and assumptions. Lady Victoria had spent months making assertions about my inadequacy, without bothering to verify whether those assertions had any factual foundation. She had been so confident in her judgments that she had shared them widely with family and social connections, creating a public narrative that the announcement had now contradicted. The discomfort she was experiencing represented natural consequences of her behavior, rather than a crisis requiring my intervention to resolve. James responded with frustration that was unusual for him, suggesting that perhaps I was being vindictive, that I was enjoying his mother's distress more than was appropriate, that my refusal to help manage the situation reflected poorly on my capacity for compassion and family harmony. His words stung precisely because they contained a fragment of truth wrapped in misdirection. I was indeed experiencing satisfaction at Lady Victoria's discomfort, but that satisfaction arose from justice rather than cruelty. She had attempted to diminish me systematically based on false assumptions, and those assumptions were now being corrected through official channels that carried authority she could not dismiss or ignore. I explained to James that my refusal to rescue his mother from the consequences of her own behavior was not vindictiveness, but rather an appropriate boundary. Lady Victoria needed to understand that making assumptions about people without adequate information carried costs, that sharing those assumptions widely amplified those costs, and that expecting the people she had wronged to protect her from natural consequences was unreasonable. If she was experiencing social embarrassment, that embarrassment flowed from her own actions rather than from my refusal to minimize or excuse those actions. The conversation with James concluded without resolution, both of us recognizing that we had reached an impasse that reflected deeper incompatibilities than could be addressed in a single phone call. He wanted me to prioritize family harmony over accountability. I wanted him to recognize that harmony built on my perpetual accommodation of his mother's cruelty was not actually harmony but rather enforced compliance with unjust dynamics. The wedding was now 12 days away, and we were further from alignment on fundamental values than we had been when he proposed. By afternoon, the announcement had generated sufficient attention that media outlets beyond specialized government and diplomatic publications had begun covering the appointment. Several newspapers ran brief articles about my elevation to a senior coordinating role, noting my age and the unusual trajectory that had led to such early recognition. The coverage was factual and professional, focusing on my qualifications and the nature of the position rather than on personal details or the upcoming wedding. However, the social media responses to these articles revealed the information spreading into broader networks where the Fitzgerald family name carried recognition. Several comments on the articles referenced the upcoming wedding, noting that I was engaged to James Fitzgerald of the Hampshire Fitzgeralds, expressing surprise that someone with my professional standing was marrying into a family known primarily for inherited wealth and social position rather than substantive accomplishment. The commentary was not unkind, but it revealed a perception that the match represented an unequal pairing, where I was actually the partner bringing more significant credentials to the relationship. Lady Victoria apparently became aware of this commentary through family members who monitored social discussions about the Fitzgerald name. According to a message I received from James's cousin Philippa, someone I had met briefly during my initial visit to Ashford Manor, Lady Victoria was increasingly agitated about public perceptions that she had attempted to prevent a highly accomplished professional from joining a family whose claims to distinction rested primarily on historical, rather than contemporary achievements. Philippa's message carried an apologetic tone, explaining that she had always found Lady Victoria's behavior toward me troubling, and was privately pleased that the announcement had revealed my actual standing. She wanted me to know that not everyone in the Fitzgerald family shared Lady Victoria's attitudes, that several relatives had been uncomfortable with her treatment of me, but had felt unable to intervene against her strong personality and established authority within family dynamics. The message concluded with an expression of hope that the upcoming wedding would proceed despite the current tensions, and that I would not judge the entire family based on Lady Victoria's conduct. I appreciated Philippa's gesture while recognizing its limitations. Individual family members expressing private support, while remaining publicly silent during months of systematic mistreatment, represented a pattern I had encountered throughout my career. People who disagreed with unjust behavior, but declined to challenge it, effectively enabled that behavior to continue while maintaining their own comfort and avoiding direct conflict. Philippa's message was kind, but it did not change the fact that Lady Victoria had operated without meaningful opposition from family members who apparently recognized her conduct as problematic. The remainder of Wednesday passed in a series of conversations with colleagues, messages from professional contacts, and responses to inquiries from people I had not spoken with in years who were reaching out to congratulate me or reconnect based on the announcement. The attention felt validating in ways that confirmed I had made the right decision in accepting the position, regardless of its implications for my personal circumstances. The work was meaningful, the recognition was earned, and the opportunity to contribute at expanded levels of responsibility, aligned with professional goals I had been pursuing throughout my career. James did not call again that evening, which felt significant. We had established a pattern of daily communication even during his frequent travels, and his silence suggested he was processing the situation in ways that required distance from me. I wondered whether he was recognizing that his mother's behavior toward me had been indefensible, or whether he was instead feeling resentful that I had not helped manage the social complications arising from her assumptions being publicly corrected. The uncertainty about which interpretation was accurate represented a deeper concern about whether we actually shared fundamental values around accountability, boundaries, and appropriate family dynamics. Thursday brought escalation. Lady Victoria apparently decided that direct confrontation was necessary to address what she characterized as a crisis-threatening family reputation and social standing. She called my mobile number at 8 o'clock in the morning, before I had departed for the office, her voice carrying an intensity that suggested she had been awake for hours preparing for the conversation. She began by stating that we needed to discuss the situation that had arisen from what she termed my failure to properly disclose my professional circumstances during the engagement period. Her framing was remarkable in its audacity, transforming her own failure to inquire adequately into my failure to volunteer information that I had not been authorized to share due to classification protocols. She suggested that proceeding with the wedding under current circumstances would create intolerable confusion about family hierarchies and social positioning that needed to be resolved before we could move forward. I interrupted her prepared statement to ask what specifically she believed needed to be resolved. My professional standing was now publicly documented. My credentials and accomplishments were established through official channels. The title I held was a matter of governmental record rather than disputed opinion. What exactly did she feel remained unclear or unresolved that required addressing before the wedding could proceed? Lady Victoria struggled to articulate a coherent response, her words revealing that the actual issue was not confusion, but rather her discomfort with reality failing to align with her preferences. She had constructed a narrative about my inadequacy that had informed her treatment of me for months. That narrative was now demonstrably false, but acknowledging its falseness would require her to confront her own misjudgment and the cruelty that had flowed from it. She was seeking instead some framework that would allow her to maintain her position while accommodating contradictory information about my actual standing and capabilities. I told Lady Victoria with deliberate courtesy that I understood her discomfort, but that I would not be participating in efforts to minimize or reframe the facts that had been publicly established. I held a senior governmental position that carried formal recognition and substantive authority. That reality was not subject to negotiation or reinterpretation based on her preferences about family hierarchy. If she was experiencing social embarrassment because the reality of my professional standing contradicted the narrative she had shared with others, that embarrassment represented natural consequences of her assumptions and her conduct rather than a problem requiring my assistance to solve. Her response revealed the core of her actual concern. She asked directly whether I intended to use my title and position to assert precedence over her at family gatherings and social occasions. The question exposed that her opposition to me had never actually been about my capabilities or my suitability for James. It had been about maintaining her own position at the apex of family hierarchy, her authority to determine who belonged and who did not, her control over how the Fitzgerald name was represented in social contexts she considered important. My appointment threatened that control because formal governmental recognition operated according to protocols that superseded social conventions governing family hierarchy. At official functions and state occasions, I would be positioned according to my title rather than according to Lady Victoria's preferences about family order. The possibility that I might outrank her in context she considered significant represented an intolerable disruption to power structures she had maintained throughout her adult life. I explained to Lady Victoria that I had no interest in asserting precedence over her at private family gatherings. However, at official functions where governmental protocol governed positioning and recognition, I would be placed according to my title because that was how formal systems operated. If she found this reality uncomfortable, her discomfort arose from her own attachment to hierarchies and control rather than from any action I was taking to diminish or challenge her. The conversation concluded with Lady Victoria stating that she would be discussing the situation with James, and that decisions would need to be made about how to proceed with wedding arrangements given the complications that had emerged. Her phrasing suggested she was considering whether to continue opposing the marriage, or whether to find some accommodation that would allow it to proceed while minimizing her own loss of face and social position. After ending the call, I sat in my flat and confronted the question I had been avoiding throughout this entire process. My instinct from the beginning had recognized that Lady Victoria's opposition represented something more fundamental than adjustment difficulties or protective maternal concern. I had known at some level that she viewed me as a threat to her control and her position, that her cruelty was strategic rather than reactive, that accommodation would never satisfy someone whose actual goal was establishing my subordination rather than achieving genuine family harmony. Yet I had ignored that instinct repeatedly, telling myself that patience and appropriate boundaries would eventually create space for improved dynamics. I had rationalized James's inadequate responses, accepted explanations that I knew were insufficient, and proceeded with wedding planning despite mounting evidence that the fundamental incompatibilities would not resolve simply because we wished them to. The announcement had forced the underlying power struggle into visibility where it could no longer be disguised as concern about wedding logistics or family tradition. Lady Victoria had revealed through her response that her actual anxiety centered on losing control and losing position rather than on any genuine concern about my suitability for her son. The question now was whether I would continue ignoring the instinct that had been signaling danger throughout this process, or whether I would finally acknowledge that proceeding with this marriage required accepting dynamics that would prove corrosive over time. The days following my conversation with Lady Victoria carried the weight of decisions approaching their final form. James requested that we meet for dinner on Friday evening, suggesting a restaurant in Mayfair that we had visited during our early months together. The location choice felt deliberate, an attempt to invoke earlier periods when our relationship had felt uncomplicated by family dynamics and competing loyalties. I agreed to the meeting while recognizing that nostalgia would not resolve the fundamental questions we now faced. I arrived at the restaurant to find James already seated, reviewing his phone with the distracted attention of someone managing multiple concerns simultaneously. He stood when I approached, kissed my cheek with familiar courtesy, and waited until I was settled before addressing what we both understood to be the purpose of the evening. His opening surprised me with its directness, dispensing with preliminary conversation to engage immediately with the substance that required discussion. James explained that he had spent the past 2 days in extensive conversations with his mother, attempting to understand her perspective while also conveying his commitment to our relationship and his expectation that she would modify her behavior going forward. According to his account, Lady Victoria had been genuinely shocked by the announcement of my appointment, not because she doubted my capabilities but because she had not understood the classified nature of my work and the security protocols that prevented complete disclosure even to intimate partners. His characterization of her response as shock rather than calculated cruelty represented exactly the kind of reframing that had characterized his approach throughout our engagement. Lady Victoria had not been operating from incomplete information that she regretted upon receiving clarification. She had been operating from assumptions that she never bothered to verify because her confidence in her own judgment made verification seem unnecessary. The distinction mattered because one situation involved understandable error, while the other involved willful disregard for truth, in service of predetermined conclusions. I asked James directly whether he truly believed his mother's response reflected surprise at new information, or whether it reflected distress at having her assumptions publicly contradicted. He hesitated before responding, the pause revealing his awareness that his explanation did not quite align with observable facts. He admitted that his mother could be rigid in her thinking, and that she struggled when reality did not conform to her expectations. However, he maintained that her rigidity arose from insecurity rather than malice, from fear of losing control rather than from genuine desire to harm me. His psychological analysis of Lady Victoria's motivations felt both accurate and insufficient. Understanding why someone behaved cruelly did not obligate me to accept that cruelty as the price of maintaining relationships. Insecurity might explain her need for control, but it did not excuse the systematic diminishment she had employed or create any obligation on my part to accommodate her emotional management through my own subordination. James was asking me to accept that because his mother's cruelty arose from psychological needs rather than pure malevolence, I should treat it as less serious than intentional harm. I explained that intentions mattered less than impacts when evaluating behavior and its consequences. Lady Victoria had spent months making me feel inadequate, excluding me from decisions about my own wedding, and publicly characterizing me as unsuitable for the family. Those actions had real effects regardless of whether they arose from insecurity or from calculated strategy. I had experienced the diminishment in the exclusion and the public dismissal. Understanding her psychological motivations did not undo those experiences or create any obligation for me to minimize them. James shifted his approach, acknowledging that his mother's behavior had been problematic, but suggesting that the announcement had already provided sufficient correction to her assumptions, and that continued confrontation would serve no constructive purpose. He pointed out that Lady Victoria was now experiencing social embarrassment, as people who had heard her earlier assessments learned about my actual professional standing. She had received natural consequences for her conduct. Requiring additional acknowledgement or apology would seem vindictive rather than just. His argument possessed surface plausibility, while fundamentally misunderstanding what accountability required. Lady Victoria was indeed experiencing social discomfort, but that discomfort arose from external perceptions rather than from internal recognition of wrongdoing. She was embarrassed that others now knew she had been wrong, not remorseful that she had caused harm through her wrongness. The distinction was crucial. Social embarrassment might teach her to be more cautious about public statements, but it would not address the underlying attitudes that had generated her behavior or prevent future expressions of those attitudes in contexts where social consequences seemed less likely. I told James that I was not seeking vindication or requiring his mother to perform ritualized apology. I was asking whether he recognized that her behavior represented something more concerning than stress-induced overreach, whether he understood that proceeding with our marriage without addressing fundamental patterns would mean accepting those patterns as permanent features of our family dynamics. His response would determine whether we shared compatible understandings of what constituted acceptable behavior and appropriate boundaries within intimate relationships. James struggled visibly with the question, his expression revealing internal conflict between loyalty to his mother and commitment to our partnership. He finally admitted that he had always known his mother could be difficult and controlling, that family gatherings often involved managing her moods and accommodating her preferences to avoid conflict. He had hoped that once we were married and established our own household, we could maintain appropriate distance while managing periodic interactions without allowing her behavior to dominate our relationship. His answer confirmed what I had increasingly suspected. James had been aware of his mother's problematic patterns, but had developed coping strategies based on avoidance and accommodation, rather than confrontation and boundary establishment. He was proposing that we adopt those same strategies, maintaining surface harmony through careful management of Lady Victoria's emotional needs, while building our actual life in spaces where her influence could be minimized. The approach was not unreasonable as survival strategy, but it represented fundamentally different values than those I brought to intimate relationships. I explained that I had built my career on refusing to accept that problematic behavior simply needed to be managed rather than addressed. When I encountered corruption in diplomatic contexts, I documented it and escalated through appropriate channels, rather than finding ways to work around it. When I observed institutional failures, I proposed reforms rather than developing personal coping mechanisms that left systemic problems intact. The professional principles that had served me effectively seemed equally applicable to personal relationships, yet James was suggesting I abandon those principles in favor of accommodation strategies that preserved harmful dynamics. Our dinner continued with both of us recognizing that we had reached an impasse that reflected incompatible approaches to navigating difficult relationships. James valued harmony and believed that maintaining family connections justified significant accommodation of problematic behavior. I valued accountability and believed that relationships worth preserving required honest confrontation of harmful patterns. Neither position was inherently wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible when applied to the same situation. James made one final attempt to find common ground, suggesting that perhaps we could proceed with the wedding while agreeing to revisit family dynamics after we had established ourselves as a married couple with clear independence from his mother's household. He proposed that we might be able to address boundary issues more effectively once we had the security of formalized commitment rather than trying to resolve everything before the ceremony. His suggestion represented reasonable pragmatism from one perspective, but from another it represented postponing essential conversations until after making permanent commitments that would complicate extraction if those conversations failed to produce workable solutions. I told James the first needed time to consider whether proceeding with the wedding under current circumstances aligned with my understanding of what healthy partnership required. He accepted this response with visible disappointment but without argument, recognizing perhaps that pushing for immediate commitment would be counterproductive when I was actively questioning whether commitment was appropriate. We parted that evening with less certainty about our future than at any previous point in our relationship. The weekend brought an unexpected intervention that revealed how extensively information about our situation had circulated through various networks. Dame Elizabeth Thornton, the permanent undersecretary who had met with me regarding my appointment, requested a private conversation at her residence in Belgravia rather than at the Foreign Office. The location suggested personal rather than official business, though with someone of Dame Elizabeth's seniority the distinction between personal and official was rarely absolute. Her home reflected a lifetime of diplomatic service, filled with art acquired during various postings and furniture that balanced comfort with understated elegance. She received me in a sitting room overlooking a private garden, offering tea while explaining that she wanted to discuss matters that extended beyond her official responsibilities, but which she felt obligated to address given her role in my recent appointment and her awareness of complications arising from my personal circumstances. Dame Elizabeth began by acknowledging that she was overstepping traditional boundaries between professional mentorship and personal advice. However, she had observed too many talented women navigate the specific challenges that arose when professional accomplishment intersected with family expectations and social positioning. She wanted to share perspective drawn from her own experience and from patterns she had witnessed repeatedly throughout her career. She explained that women who achieved significant professional recognition often encountered resistance from family systems that had formed their identities around different assumptions about appropriate female roles and capabilities. This resistance typically manifested through subtle diminishment, systematic exclusion from decision-making, and reframing of accomplishments as somehow less significant than they actually were. The resistance arose not from explicit opposition to female achievement, but from discomfort with disruptions to established hierarchies, and from anxiety about losing control over narratives that had previously seemed stable. Dame Elizabeth had encountered these patterns in her own family when her career progressed beyond what her mother-in-law considered appropriate for married women. She had faced choices between accommodating family expectations through professional limitation or establishing boundaries that preserved her career trajectory, while accepting family conflict as the cost of those boundaries. She had chosen boundaries, and while that choice had created sustained tension with certain family members, it had ultimately proven essential to both her professional success and her personal integrity. Her advice was not to abandon my relationship with James, but rather to evaluate honestly whether he possessed the capacity and willingness to establish boundaries that would protect our partnership from his mother's controlling tendencies. Some men could make that transition, recognizing that their primary loyalty belonged to their chosen partner rather than to their family of origin. Other men never successfully completed that psychological separation, remaining fundamentally more committed to maintaining parental approval than to defending partnership boundaries. Dame Elizabeth suggested that distinguishing between these categories was essential before making permanent commitments that would be far more complicated to extract from than to avoid entering. I asked how she had evaluated her own husband's capacity to establish appropriate boundaries with his family. She explained that she had tested the question directly by creating situations where he needed to choose between accommodating his mother's preferences and supporting her professional decisions. His responses had revealed that while he found the conflicts uncomfortable, he consistently prioritized their partnership over his mother's expectations when forced to choose. That consistency had provided confidence that marriage would not require choosing between her career and family harmony. Dame Elizabeth recommended that I create similar tests before the wedding, situations that would reveal whether James possessed the capacity to establish boundaries when doing so created genuine conflict with his mother. His responses during our engagement had been concerning, but potentially reflected the ambiguity of a transitional period, where loyalties remained unclear. Marriage would eliminate that ambiguity, making primary commitments explicit. The question was whether James would rise to those commitments or whether he would continue prioritizing his mother's emotional needs over appropriate partnership boundaries. Her final observation struck with particular force. She noted that the announcement of my appointment had already created a natural test of exactly the dynamics I needed to understand. Lady Victoria was experiencing distress arising directly from her own conduct and assumptions. James was being forced to choose between supporting me as I maintained appropriate boundaries or protecting his mother from consequences she had earned. His choices during this period would reveal whether he possessed the capacity to be the partner I needed, or whether his psychological commitments would always place me in competition with his mother for his primary loyalty. I left Dame Elizabeth's home with renewed clarity about the questions that required answering before the wedding could proceed. James had suggested we address boundary issues after marriage, but Dame Elizabeth had articulated why that approach was fundamentally flawed. The patterns we established during this crisis would persist and intensify after marriage, unless James demonstrated capacity for different choices. If he could not establish boundaries now, when the facts so clearly supported doing so, he would not magically develop that capacity after we had formalized commitments that made extraction far more complicated. The following Monday brought the next phase of what was becoming an extended test of James's capacity and priorities. Lady Victoria apparently decided that direct appeal to me had been insufficient, and that she required external validation for her perspective. She contacted my parents, requesting a conversation about concerns she felt needed to be addressed before the wedding proceeded. My mother called to inform me of the contact and to ask whether I wanted her to decline the conversation or whether engaging might serve some useful purpose. I told my mother that she should accept the conversation if she felt comfortable doing so. Lady Victoria's attempt to recruit my parents as allies in pressuring me to accommodate her demands would likely prove more revealing than any direct confrontation between us. My mother's assessment of Lady Victoria's actual motivations and her evaluation of what the conversation revealed about family dynamics would provide valuable external perspective on situations I was too close to evaluate with complete objectivity. My parents met with Lady Victoria at Ashford Manor 2 days later. According to my mother's subsequent account, the meeting had been remarkable for what it revealed about Lady Victoria's understanding of the situation and her expectations regarding how it should be resolved. Lady Victoria had positioned the conversation as concerned potential in-laws discussing how to support young people navigating stressful circumstances. She had portrayed herself as someone genuinely worried about whether the marriage would succeed given the unexpected complications arising from my professional appointment and the social attention it had generated. Lady Victoria had explained to my parents that she felt I was being unreasonable in my response to what she characterized as minor disagreements about wedding planning details. She had suggested that my professional success might have created an inflated sense of my own importance that was making me less flexible and accommodating than successful marriages required. She had expressed concern that I was allowing career ambitions to overshadow the personal compromises that would be necessary to build sustainable family relationships. My mother, with the directness that came from decades of nursing work where clear communication could mean the difference between life and death, had asked Lady Victoria to specify what accommodations she felt I should be making that I was currently refusing. The question had apparently created visible discomfort as Lady Victoria struggled to articulate concrete requests that would sound reasonable when stated explicitly. She had eventually mentioned my refusal to call her to discuss how to manage social complications arising from the announcement, framing that refusal as indicative of my general unwillingness to prioritize family harmony. My father had then asked a question that had apparently shifted the entire tone of the meeting. He had inquired whether Lady Victoria had ever considered that the social complications she was experiencing arose from her own choices to share assessments of my inadequacy before verifying whether those assessments had any factual foundation. He had pointed out that people who made confident public statements that were subsequently proven false should expect to experience embarrassment, and that expecting the people they had misjudged to rescue them from that embarrassment seemed to reverse appropriate responsibility. According to my mother's account, Lady Victoria had responded with barely concealed anger, suggesting that my parents clearly did not understand the social context in which the Fitzgerald family operated, or the expectations that governed behavior in those contexts. My father had replied that he understood quite well that in any social context, making false statements about people tended to generate negative consequences for the person making those statements, and that those consequences represented justice rather than injustice regardless of what social class was involved. The meeting had concluded shortly thereafter, with Lady Victoria apparently recognizing that my parents would not serve as allies in her effort to pressure me into accommodation. My mother reported that Lady Victoria had seemed genuinely surprised that they had not been more sympathetic to her position or more concerned about my unwillingness to prioritize family harmony. The surprise suggested that Lady Victoria had expected class solidarity or shared concern about my professional ambitions creating complications for traditional family structures. My parents' account of the meeting provided valuable confirmation of patterns I had observed but sometimes questioned. Lady Victoria genuinely believed she was the aggrieved party in our conflict, that my refusal to accommodate her demands represented the problematic behavior requiring correction. She had sought validation from my parents, expecting that any reasonable people would recognize her position as justified and would pressure me accordingly. The failure of that expectation had apparently been disorienting for her, creating additional anxiety about whether she had fundamentally misread the situation. I called James after speaking with my parents to ask whether he had been aware that his mother was contacting them. He admitted that she had mentioned her intention, and that he had not discouraged her, believing that perhaps my parents could provide perspective that would help me understand his mother's concerns and approach the situation with more flexibility. His answer revealed that he had hoped my parents would validate his mother's position and encourage me to accommodate her demands, suggesting his judgment about the situation remained fundamentally aligned with hers despite his professed commitment to our partnership. I asked James directly whether he understood that his mother's appeal to my parents represented an escalation, rather than a de-escalation of conflict, that recruiting additional parties to pressure me was not consistent with respecting boundaries or working toward genuine resolution. He responded with frustration that I was interpreting everything his mother did in the worst possible light, that perhaps her outreach to my parents had been motivated by genuine desire to understand my perspective rather than to pressure me into compliance. His interpretation was theoretically possible, but inconsistent with the actual content of the meeting as my parents had described it. Lady Victoria had not inquired about my perspective or sought to understand my concerns. She had presented her narrative and expected validation. James's unwillingness or inability to recognize this pattern, even when the facts were clear, suggested cognitive commitments that would persist regardless of how much evidence accumulated contradicting his preferred understanding. The wedding was now 8 days away. Invitations had been sent. Arrangements had been finalized. Guests had made travel plans. The machinery of a large formal wedding was in motion, and stopping it would create complications extending far beyond the immediate parties. Yet the accumulating evidence suggested that proceeding would mean accepting family dynamics that were fundamentally incompatible with my understanding of healthy relationships and appropriate boundaries. I had sought external validation through Dame Elizabeth's perspective, through my parents' assessment, and through watching James's responses to situations that revealed his actual priorities when tested. Every external perspective confirmed what my own instincts had been signaling throughout the engagement period. The question now was whether I would finally trust those instincts and act accordingly, or whether I would continue ignoring them in favor of hoping that circumstances would somehow improve despite all evidence suggesting they would not. The week preceding what was supposed to be my wedding date, brought a professional crisis that demanded the full application of capabilities I had developed over 12 years of diplomatic service. A situation had emerged in the South China Sea involving overlapping territorial claims, unauthorized naval exercises, and communication breakdowns between multiple governments that threatened to escalate into something far more serious, if not managed with precision and discretion. My new role positioned me to coordinate between intelligence assessments and diplomatic responses, requiring exactly the kind of multi-layered analysis and strategic thinking that had led to my appointment. The contrast between my professional functioning and my personal circumstances could not have been more pronounced. At the Foreign Office, I was managing complex negotiations involving 6 different governments, analyzing intelligence reports to distinguish genuine threats from posturing, and developing response frameworks that balance firmness with flexibility. I was operating at the highest levels of competence, making decisions that would affect international relations and potentially prevent military escalation. My colleagues trusted my judgment, sought my input on sensitive matters, and implemented recommendations I provided based on analysis they found persuasive and reliable. Yet in my personal life, I was struggling to establish basic boundaries with a future mother-in-law whose behavior would have been immediately recognized as manipulative and inappropriate if I had encountered it in any professional context. The disconnect was striking. I could navigate diplomatic protocols involving heads of state, but I was somehow unable to extract myself from family dynamics that were clearly dysfunctional and becoming increasingly untenable. The South China Sea situation required round-the-clock monitoring and coordination. I spent 3 consecutive days essentially living at the Foreign Office, catching sleep in brief intervals between briefing cycles and coordination calls with counterparts in allied governments. The work was demanding but clarifying. Every action had purpose. Every communication served strategic objectives. Every relationship operated according to professional protocols that created accountability and transparency. When disagreements arose, they were addressed through established processes rather than through emotional manipulation or appeals to loyalty. Dame Elizabeth observed my performance during this crisis period with the evaluative attention of someone assessing whether her confidence in my appointment had been justified. On the 3rd day, after a particularly complex negotiation that had successfully de-escalated tensions while preserving all parties' essential interests, she invited me to her office for what she termed a strategic debrief but which I recognized as mentorship disguised as professional evaluation. She began by acknowledging the quality of work I had delivered during the crisis, noting specific decisions that had demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to balance competing objectives while maintaining credibility with multiple stakeholders. Her praise was specific and earned, focusing on substantive contributions rather than offering generic encouragement. She then shifted to observations about patterns she had noticed in how I approached professional challenges compared to how I was navigating personal circumstances. Dame Elizabeth pointed out that in professional contexts, I demonstrated exceptional capacity for clear-eyed assessment of situations, recognition of patterns that others missed, and willingness to act decisively based on analysis, rather than hoping that problems would resolve themselves through time or avoidance. I documented concerns, escalated issues appropriately, and insisted on accountability when circumstances warranted. These capabilities had made me successful in diplomatic work, and had contributed to my selection for expanded responsibilities. However, she observed that I appeared to be applying completely different standards to my personal situation. I was accepting behavior from Lady Victoria that I would never tolerate in professional contexts. I was rationalizing James's inadequate responses in ways that contradicted my usual analytical rigor. I was hoping that problems would somehow resolve despite accumulating evidence that they would not. The professional competence I demonstrated at work was somehow not being applied to circumstances that would significantly affect my long-term well-being and life satisfaction. Her analysis was uncomfortably accurate. I had been compartmentalizing my professional and personal lives in ways that allowed me to maintain high standards in one domain, while accepting far lower standards in the other. The compartmentalization had perhaps been sustainable when my personal and professional identities occupied separate spaces, but the announcement of my appointment had collapsed those boundaries. I could no longer maintain the fiction that the woman who coordinated international crisis responses and the woman who was accepting systematic diminishment from her future mother-in-law were somehow different people operating in different contexts. Dame Elizabeth asked whether I had considered that my willingness to accept inappropriate behavior in personal relationships might eventually begin affecting my professional judgment. She explained that she had observed this pattern repeatedly throughout her career. Talented professionals who tolerated manipulation or boundary violations in their personal lives eventually began applying similar tolerance to professional situations where such accommodation was dangerous. The psychological habits developed in one context eventually migrated to others, eroding the clear judgment that had initially seemed separate from personal compromises. Her concern was not merely about my personal happiness, though she cared about that as well. Her concern was institutional. The Foreign Office had invested in my development and had elevated me to a position of significant responsibility based on demonstrated judgment and integrity. If my personal circumstances were compromising those qualities, that represented a professional concern that extended beyond individual well-being to questions of organizational effectiveness and risk management. I asked Dame Elizabeth directly whether she was suggesting that my appointment was contingent on resolving my personal situation in particular ways. She clarified that the appointment was not conditional in that sense. However, she was encouraging me to apply the same analytical rigor to my personal life that I brought to professional challenges, because maintaining the kind of compartmentalization I had been practicing was neither sustainable nor healthy for someone operating at the levels of responsibility my position required. Her guidance provided the external perspective I needed to recognize patterns I had been avoiding examining directly. I was demonstrating classic cognitive dissonance, maintaining incompatible beliefs by refusing to examine them in relation to each other. I believed I was a competent professional with sound judgment. I also believed I should proceed with a marriage despite overwhelming evidence that doing so meant accepting dynamics that were fundamentally unhealthy. Those beliefs could not both be true, yet I had been avoiding the cognitive work of reconciling them by keeping them in separate mental compartments. The South China Sea crisis concluded successfully late Thursday evening. Multiple governments had agreed to communication protocols that would prevent similar misunderstandings in the future. Naval exercises had been rescheduled to avoid overlapping in ways that created unnecessary tension. Intelligence sharing arrangements had been strengthened to ensure all parties had access to information that would allow accurate assessment of others' intentions, rather than relying on speculation that tended toward worst-case assumptions. The outcome represented exactly the kind of diplomatic success that justified the coordinating role I had been appointed to fulfill. After the final briefing concluded and various officials departed to brief their respective governments, I remained in the conference room gathering documents and processing what the past 72 hours had revealed about my own capabilities and my current trajectory. I had just successfully navigated an international crisis involving multiple governments, competing interests, and genuine risks of military escalation. I had done so with confidence, clarity, and effectiveness that had earned respect from senior officials across multiple agencies and allied governments. Yet I was contemplating proceeding with a marriage to someone who could not or would not establish basic boundaries with his mother, whose response to her cruelty had been to seek accommodation rather than accountability, and whose priorities when tested had consistently favored his mother's comfort over our partnership's integrity. The professional competence I had just demonstrated stood in stark contrast to the personal choices I was apparently still considering making. I left the Foreign Office as dawn was breaking over London, the early morning light illuminating streets that were just beginning to fill with people starting their daily routines. I walked along the Thames toward my flat, using the physical movement to process thoughts that had been accumulating throughout the crisis period. The wedding was now 5 days away. Final preparations were being completed. Out-of-town guests were beginning to arrive. The event was approaching its inevitable conclusion, unless I took action to alter its trajectory. My phone contained 17 messages from James, sent over the 3 days I had been consumed by the South China Sea situation. The messages traced a progression from concern about my well-being during the demanding work period, to frustration that I was not responding to his attempts to reach me, to anxiety about wedding preparations that required my input, to resignation that my work was apparently taking priority over our relationship during what should have been a period of shared focus on our upcoming marriage. The final message, sent at 11 o'clock the previous evening, asked directly whether I was reconsidering the wedding and using work as an excuse to avoid conversations we needed to have. His question was perceptive in ways that suggested he recognized what I had not yet fully acknowledged. I was indeed reconsidering, though not as consciously as his message implied. The work had been genuinely demanding and had required my full attention. However, I had also welcomed the clarity it provided compared to the ambiguity and emotional complexity of my personal circumstances. I called James from my flat after showering and changing into fresh clothes. He answered immediately, his voice carrying relief mixed with residual frustration from 3 days of limited communication. I apologized for not responding more promptly to his messages, explaining the intensity of the work situation, while acknowledging that I could have found moments to provide brief updates. He accepted the apology while noting that his concern arose not merely from lack of communication but from patterns suggesting I was more comfortable in professional contexts than in addressing our personal situation. His observation was accurate enough that I did not attempt to dispute it. I told him that we needed to have an honest conversation about whether proceeding with the wedding served either of our interests given the unresolved tensions and the patterns that had become increasingly clear throughout our engagement. I suggested we meet that afternoon after I had slept for a few hours, somewhere private where we could speak frankly without concern about being overheard or interrupted. James agreed to the meeting with what sounded like resignation, as if he had been anticipating this conversation and perhaps privately relieved that it was finally occurring. We arranged to meet at my flat at 3 o'clock. The conversation would either resolve the questions that had been accumulating or it would clarify that resolution was not possible, and that proceeding with the wedding would be a mistake we would both regret. I slept for 3 hours, a deep unconscious state that felt more like surrender than rest. When I woke, my mind possessed unusual clarity about what needed to be said, and what questions required honest answers before any decisions could be made. I prepared tea and reviewed notes I had been keeping throughout the engagement, documentation of incidents and patterns that had seemed individually manageable, but which collectively revealed dynamics that were profoundly concerning. James arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, his punctuality reflecting the military precision his father had apparently instilled in him during childhood. He looked tired in ways that suggested he had slept poorly over the past several days. We sat in my living room with tea between us, and I began the conversation with direct acknowledgement of where we had arrived. I explained that I loved him and valued many aspects of our relationship, but that I had serious concerns about whether we possessed compatible approaches to family dynamics, boundaries, and accountability. His mother had behaved in ways that I found unacceptable throughout our engagement. More troubling than her behavior was his response to it, which had consistently prioritized avoiding conflict over establishing appropriate boundaries. I needed to understand whether he recognized these patterns and was willing to address them, or whether he believed my expectations were unreasonable, and that successful marriage would require me to accept dynamics he considered normal, or at least manageable. James responded with visible discomfort, acknowledging that his mother had been difficult but suggesting that I was perhaps being inflexible in my expectations about how family relationships should function. He pointed out that all families had complicated dynamics, that perfect harmony was unrealistic, and that successful marriages required compromise and accommodation of imperfect circumstances. He suggested that my professional success might have created expectations about control and precision that were appropriate in diplomatic work, but unrealistic in personal relationships where emotions and histories created messier realities. His response revealed the fundamental disconnect I had been sensing throughout our engagement. James was framing the question as one of my unrealistic expectations rather than one of his mother's inappropriate behavior and his inadequate response to it. He was suggesting that maturity and relationship success required accepting dysfunction rather than insisting on healthier patterns. His framework positioned me as the problematic party for refusing to accommodate circumstances he considered simply part of normal family life. I asked James to consider a hypothetical scenario. If one of my colleagues at the Foreign Office consistently undermined my work, excluded me from important meetings, publicly questioned my competence, and recruited others to support their assessment of my inadequacy, how should I respond? Should I accept that all workplaces have difficult personalities, and that professional success requires accommodating problematic behavior? Or should I document the conduct, address it through appropriate channels, and insist on professional standards being maintained? James admitted that in professional contexts, addressing problematic behavior directly was appropriate and necessary. However, He suggested that family relationships operated according to different principles, that blood connections and long histories created obligations that did not exist in professional settings, and that insisting on the same standards in both contexts was unrealistic and potentially damaging to important relationships. His distinction between professional and personal standards was exactly what Dame Elizabeth had warned against. James was arguing that family relationships should operate according to lower standards than professional ones, that emotional connection created permission for behavior that would be unacceptable between colleagues or acquaintances. The implication was that love obligated tolerance of mistreatment in ways that professional relationships did not. I explained that I understood families were different from workplaces in important ways, but that the fundamental principles of respect, boundaries, and accountability applied across all contexts where healthy relationships existed. In fact, I would argue that intimate relationships required higher standards than professional ones because their impacts on well-being were more profound and more enduring. Accepting systematic diminishment from someone I worked with would be problematic. Accepting it from someone who would be part of my family for decades was untenable. James asked what specifically I wanted him to do differently. I explained that I needed him to recognize his mother's behavior as unacceptable, rather than as difficult but normal. I needed him to establish clear boundaries with her about how she could and could not treat me. I needed him to prioritize our partnership over her comfort when those interests conflicted. I needed him to understand that his role as my husband would require defending me from mistreatment regardless of its source, including from his own mother when her conduct warranted such defense. His response after a long silence revealed everything I needed to understand about whether we could proceed. He said that what I was describing sounded like asking him to choose between his mother and me, and that creating such binary choices seemed unfair and likely to damage our relationship, even if he made the choice I wanted. He suggested that healthy marriages found ways to accommodate all family members, rather than forcing painful decisions about loyalty and priority. I explained that I was not asking him to choose between maintaining a relationship with his mother and maintaining a relationship with me. I was asking him to choose between enabling her mistreatment of me and establishing boundaries that protected our partnership. Those were fundamentally different choices. He could have both relationships. He could not have both a healthy marriage and a pattern of prioritizing his mother's desire to control and diminish me over my need for respect and appropriate treatment. James struggled with the distinction I was drawing, his expression revealing that from his perspective the difference felt semantic rather than substantive. In his understanding, establishing boundaries with his mother would create sufficient conflict that maintaining a functional relationship with her would become extremely difficult. Therefore, what I characterized as asking for appropriate boundaries, he experienced as effectively asking him to sacrifice his relationship with his mother for the sake of our marriage. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, circling through the same territory from different angles without achieving meaningful progress. James could not or would not recognize that his framework equated his mother's desire to control with my need for respect, treating them as equivalent competing interests requiring compromise. I could not accept that framework because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what was at stake. One person's desire to dominate was not equivalent to another person's requirement for dignity. As evening approached and our conversation reached its natural conclusion without resolution, I told James that I needed to make a final decision about whether to proceed with the wedding. I asked him to consider one last question with complete honesty. If we married and his mother continued behaving as she had throughout our engagement, what would he actually do? Not what he hoped he might do or what he thought I wanted to hear, but what he honestly believed his response would be based on patterns he had demonstrated over the past year. James answered with a candor that was almost painful to hear. He admitted that he would probably continue trying to manage the situation through accommodation and avoidance. He would encourage me to be patient with his mother while hoping that time would improve dynamics. He would seek compromises that would allow everyone to maintain their relationships, while minimizing direct conflict. He would struggle with feeling caught between two people he cared about who seemed determined to force him into choosing between them. His honesty was valuable even as it confirmed what I had already concluded. James was not capable of or willing to establish the boundaries that would be necessary for our marriage to function healthily while his mother maintained her current approach. He believed accommodation was the appropriate strategy. I believed accountability was necessary. Those positions were irreconcilable, and proceeding with the marriage would mean accepting that his position would govern our family dynamics because he would never implement mine. I thanked James for his honesty and told him I needed the evening alone to make my final decision. He left my flat with both of us recognizing that the wedding scheduled for 4 days hence was extremely unlikely to occur as planned, and that the relationship we had spent the past year building was reaching its conclusion not because we did not care for each other but because we possessed fundamentally incompatible values about what healthy relationships required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.